Greetings once again. Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and we're back for our next reading of Machiavelli's Prince. Today we're doing chapter 12. Now, chapters 12, 13, and 14 make up a kind of break from what Machiavelli's been doing previously. Machiavelli, before this point, has spelling out the various types of principalities, princely rules, and the different forms that they were operated. Now, he's changing his topic here today, and this will be a kind of break, focusing on the question of arms. Okay, and we'll talk about this. Now, this is today's reading is chapter 12. How many kinds of militia there are, and about mercenary soldiers. Okay. This chapter is divided up into 9 paragraphs. That's why is that important? It's in Italian. It's the 9 paragraphs structure of the thing. We'll focus on again. We're using the translation of Machiavelli's Prince that I'm using here is Leopold de Alvarez's translation, published by Waveland. It's currently published by Waveland. You can find copies from the older edition, published when it was published by the University of Dallas Press. But this is my old battered copy of the Waveland, of this slightly revised from the University of Dallas version edition. There's a link to it below. Let's start out. Okay. Having discussed in particular all the qualities of those principates which in the beginning I proposed to reason upon, and having considered in some part the causes for their well and ill being, and having shown the modes with which many have sought to acquire and keep them, now it remains for me to discuss generally the offenses and defenses which can be adopted by each of those named above. So he basically says, okay, before here, I kind of, with what I've done so far, I have outlined the things I said I'd outline. Okay, about the types of the princes, how to acquire them, the means of how they were acquired, and so forth and so on, and having shown, as he says, having shown the modes which they have been sought to acquire and to keep them. Now he needs to deal with generally the offenses and defenses which can be adopted by the previous examples. Okay, now, this next sentence here. We have said above how necessary it is that a prince have good foundation, semicolon. Otherwise, he comes to ruin out of necessity. Okay? So therefore, you need to have good foundations. He said, we've said this before, I'm repeating it. You need to have good foundations. If you don't have good foundations, you will be ruined. Necessity will ruin you. Okay, it's not a question of, well, maybe fortune will be on your side and you get lucky. No, but the course of things will lead to your ruin. So if you don't have good foundations, the ultimate condition will probably be ruin. So therefore he goes, the principal foundation which all states have, whether new, old, mixed, so therefore all states, whether they're new, old, or mixed, are good laws and good arms. So now this is important. In other words, the foundation, he says, are both good laws and good arms. Now, he now does it. This is going to be very important because in many accounts he does not discuss laws. He won't discuss laws, and he's going to use an argument, a kind of a trick here. It's kind of an argument. Now he says this is like very much axiomatic. He's using a kind of axioms, deductive arguments, kind of deductive axiomatic arguments. He said, okay, without good foundations, you will be ruined. Okay. What are good foundations? Good foundations are good laws and good arms. Now, he will say, and because there cannot be good laws where there are not good arms. Okay, so there cannot be good laws without good arms, right? So good laws depend upon good arms, dam. Second, comma, and where there are good arms, there needs must be good laws, comma. I shall omit the reasoning on laws and speak of arms. What? He makes an assertion here. The assertion here is because, in other words, the idea here is that law without arms is meaningless. But to have good arms, you need good laws. You cannot, in other words, if you didn't have good laws, you would not have good arms. This is an assumption. Now the question here, is it necessarily true here? This is the thing that, or is this kind of, he does this to avoid the discussion of laws? He focuses on warfare, in other words, war, weapons, arms, because he doesn't want to do, no, there is a trick here. To what degree are arms themselves? Remember, law is, what is law? Law is not justice. Law is not principally just commands or norms or, things we want to say. They're written statements, words. There are verbiage. We had another class I'm teaching right now in international law. Someone called it was this mere verbiage. Law is mere verbiage. And I said, well, no, it's verbiage plus force. Law is justice plus the sword, okay? Law is coercion. It is a statement or words issued by someone that if it's not followed, or not obeyed, or not complied by, there is a promise or threat of coercion to uphold it, or to ensure that it's followed. So, there is an implicit idea in the nature of law itself. Law is not just mere justice. It's remember, the ancient Greeks always understood that law was like opinion. The difference between opinion and truth. The difference between what we believe to be so, and opinion is what our beliefs are. That's why the Greek always calls their doxa, right? And the doxa, or our beliefs, our opinions, are things that we think are true. But then once we test them and verify them or teach them to experience and validate them or invalidate them, then we know they're either true or false, or whether they're valid or invalid, okay? And that's the difference between opinion and knowledge, right? Well, the difference between law and justice is what law is a community's, usually a community's, authoritative sense of what justice is, right? Now, law is always kind of tied to the particular regime, the government, the people, these things. They can be their customs, their habits, their ways of life, but it's always tied to that regime. There's no universal law in this original sense. There may be justice. There may be universal norms of justice that therefore states that, with their laws, strive towards. Sometimes they may achieve, sometimes most likely they don't achieve. But again, they strive towards them. Now, Machiavelli doesn't really want to get discussion. Actually, the great writers of the past, Plato, Aristotle, always focus on justice. The great writers, Cicero and Plato and even Aristotle to some, Aristotle, ethics. We'll talk about virtue and the good life, the good city, the just, about justice. Machiavelli wants to move away from justice per se. It's not that he doesn't want justice. He's concerned that all this talk about justice takes our eyes away from the things necessary in order for us to enjoy or secure justice, to benefit from these things. And Machiavelli therefore makes the point here about this. And this is why this is a very interesting trick here. Because at one level, he looks, by doing this trick, he seems to, at one level, dismiss law. But is he really dismissing law? Is he really dismissing justice? Is he really as dismissive? The shock, this is one of those lines that his trick here, verbal trick, is a very shocking trick, because he's basically saying, I'm not going to talk about law. I'm just going to talk about arms. That's shocking. In a treatise about a prince, the mirror is a prince, or what should a prince be? The traditional situation is, well, princes should always learn about laws and, should uphold the law. Machiavelli instead speaks about arms. Now, to what degree and in fact, he makes it, now this is another thing, the implicit argument is you cannot have good arms without good laws. Therefore, in the discussion of arms, there must be a implicit argument about laws. So we have to pay attention to the argument of arms to discover the argument about laws that Machiavelli is presenting in this work. In other words, we have to always remember the Prince is written for people who have no time. There's always this argument, the Discourses and the Prince are two different books. It's about his discussion about principalities and autocratic rule, and that his teaching on republics and popular rule is in the Discourses. Now that's nonsense. The difference between the Republic and the Discourses and the Republic, the Prince, is not the subject. The subject is, if you go read the Discourses and you read the dedication letter, it again he asserts, he's giving the difference is that he's asserting that in the Discourses everything he knows is present. He's giving everything he knows about what the ancient writers talked about in his experience on modern political things. Again, echoing the Epistle Dedicatory in the Prince, right? So therefore, this is everything. Again, the difference here is the difference between the audience. The Prince is dedicated to a prince, man of action, who don't have time. Men of action do not have time, and they often lack leisure. The Discourses is written for young men who have much leisure, and therefore can discuss things fuller in more detail. So the difference here is not that, therefore, in other words, because of the briefness of time, Machiavelli will kind of just has to make some editorial choices. Do I want to go give a long discussion of law? No, I don't. So let's go. But what's more important? Weapons, the arms. The Prince is going to have to know more about arms, and particularly the danger of those arms. In that sense, some of those arms, and therefore, by implication, understanding the laws. Remember, there was an argument about the German cities. Why the German cities are free, and the German cities are free. In the previous chapter, he mentions is because they had good laws about the militia, that the citizens are armed and free to the highest degree. Okay, the Swiss particularly. The Swiss and the old German cities, the Swiss and the German cities are free because they have respected the traditions of armed citizenry, of training them, of requiring them to train them, of this. Now, this is a very important point here. So therefore, to understand the discussion, therefore, it's not a mere, as I said, this is not a mere tossing out of the discussion of laws. It's that the laws are present, but they're not present. They're present implicitly. So now let's turn to a second sentence. I say, then, that the arms which a prince defends his state are either his own, mercenary, auxiliary, or mixed. Now he basically has four. Actually three, with the fourth being a mix, blend. So what is that? What are they? They're your own soldiers. Okay, they belong to you. Okay, mercenary. I mean, these are people. Again, mercenaries are what? People you hire, companies They're basically businesses of people who fight. Independent contractors. Okay, you can say. And then next but not least, auxiliary, which auxiliary means allies. The force, in other words, someone else's force that you're using. Now, of these two, and mixed are blends of both your own mercenary arms and that. And we have to go back to the discussion of Cesare Borgia a few chapters ago, where that discussion, this kind of reinforces the discussion of what he said about Borgia's use of arms. First, he relied mercenary arms, but the Pope and Alexander's his father Alexander and Cesare relied on mercenary arms for the Vatican. The problem with those was they were not loyal. They would not fight for you. They won't die for you. Remember that line? They won't fight for you. They won't die for a little stipend. Then what happened was he relied on first French, then Spanish arms, auxiliary arms, and then what happened was he then used a mixture of mercenary and Spanish arms, and then by eliminating the rivals and making the mercenary subordinate captains his, and their men his, Cesare turned to forming his own arms. Okay, after he captured the Romagna with the help of the French. Now, what this did was this armed himself, and the church took it over when Cesare lost. When Alexander died, Julius got a hold of it. These forces, this army of his own, and he operated under mixed arms, not only his own troops, but again with mixed mercenary and force arms. So therefore, these are the dynamics that Machiavelli operates with. This idea of your own arms, mercenary arms, auxiliary arms, and mixed. The mercenary and auxiliary arms are useless and dangerous. And if one keeps his state founded on mercenary arms, he will never be at rest or secure, because those arms are disunited, ambitious, without discipline, unfaithful, vainglorious among friends, cowardly among enemies. They do not fear God, nor do they keep faith with men. Ruin is delayed only as long as attack is delayed. As such, one is despoiled by them in peace and by enemies in war. Full stop, period. This is that great attack, this criticism that Machiavelli gives of mercenary arms. Now, he basically reinforces what he said earlier to it. There's no disagreement here. His argument here is that they're useless. He says there's two things. He says auxiliary and mercenary arms are both useless and dangerous. And then there's the semicolon. And then and if anyone who keeps, now then he says, whoever keeps his state founded on mercenary arms. He says, in other words, if your state is founded, now, auxiliary arms are not your state. That is, the arms, it belongs to the other prince, another ruler, another regime, another country or force. So therefore, that's not relevant. But if you don't have your own, if you don't trust your people and you rely on mercenary arms, you're never secure. Okay, remember, this goes back to the other point about always relying on the people. Relying on the people, getting the people for your support in the previous chapter, particularly chapter 9. I think it was about civic principle. Ecclesiastical, but no. Yeah, the civic principle is number 9, and that you gotta understand that civic principle was the example of having the people, and the question of the people versus the great being your support mechanism. So having your own arms implies that you are your own man, yours. Whereas if you're relying on mercenaries, you don't. The reason why you do this often is you don't trust the people, you don't trust the soldiers to be armed, or the great to be armed. So you're hired outsiders. And what happens here? He says here, because those arms are disunited, ambiguous, and without discipline, unfaithful, vainglorious among friends, cowardly among enemies. They do not fear God, and they do not keep faith with men. And he goes then, and therefore, because of this, the ruin is delayed only as much as attack is delayed. And one is despoiled by them in peace, and enemies in war. In other words, in peace, the cost of them ruin you. And in war, they're useless, they're in a way, and they often trade sides, therefore the enemies will destroy you. So they're completely useless in a sense. They are very willing to be your soldiers while you do not make war. But when war comes, they flee and go away. This ends the second paragraph. This idea of the uselessness of mercenaries. Because again, people do not die for pay. People do not die for you for money. A little stipend, he said earlier in a previous chapter. They die for you because they love you, or they think, or they have an interest in it. They have an interest in this. They have an interest in you. They get some benefit from you. They get some good or benefit that you give them, not money, but some good and benefit, something that they benefit from, and they need you for that purpose. Then they're willing to die for you, or for their sons. If that's not the case, they won't offer you their sons, or in other words, they either love you or they get something from you. And this is what is important about in that fundamental sense. Mercenaries just get money from you, and the only thing they care about is the money. They're in it for the money, and they don't want to die. They don't want to die. They might go fight, but they don't want to die. And it continues now. I should not have to work very hard to persuade anyone of this point. For the ruin of Italy today, this is the time he's writing, okay, is caused by nothing other than her reliance for many years upon mercenary arms. Period. These arms certainly did some service for a few people, a few states, a few entities. And they may have seemed valueless when among themselves. But when the foreigner came, they showed what they were. Hence, Charles, King of France, was allowed to take Italy with chalk. In other words, this is a line Machiavelli talks about. Footnote 4, the expression attributed to French historians Philippe de Comines to Alexander VI, Pope Alexander. The French, according to the Pope, needed only chalk and wooden spurs to conquer Italy. Chalk to mark their lodgings and wooden spurs to prick their mules forward. Because why? They relied on cannon. They relied on their cannon to do things. And the French and the cannon will be what? Will slaughter the mercenaries. The mercenaries, seeing armed soldiers who are going to fight for a king, disciplined, they ran away. They broke. They wouldn't fight. So this is what the line that Machiavelli repeats about the chalk. The French would only need chalk in that sense. And why the mercenaries were. And he who said that our sins were the cause of this also said the truth, for they were certainly not those which he believed, but those which I have narrated. And because these sins were sins of princes, they have also suffered the penalty. Now, this is a very interesting line. This is a line to Savonarola. Savonarola, the friar who helped establish the Republic in Florence. He preached on 1st November 1419, All Saints' Days, that Charles' entrance into Italy was the scourge of God to the Italians in general, and to Florence in particular. And that this scourge was done because of the sinfulness of the Florentines and the Italian people. But again, Machiavelli's point was, well, he's right, but the sin he had in mind, Savonarola thought the sin was, not being good enough and violating the scripture and enjoying pleasure and things like this. Where Machiavelli says, no, their sin was trusting in mercenary arms. And that this was a sin of the princes, and therefore they perished from this. Now, this is a very important. This is interesting. Machiavelli does have no. He is, in other words, he believes in sin. This idea at this moment. Sin and virtue is not something he dismisses. We think of Machiavelli as this calculating guy who does not. He dismisses virtue and vice and things like that. No. He takes them very seriously. He takes them a little bit more serious than people think. It's not that there are sins you commit that will destroy you. There's consequences to your actions. There's consequences to your behavior. Machiavelli does not deny this, and your character can destroy you. In other words, your actions can shape your character and shapes your habits, and therefore some of this character can be beneficial, and some of this can be harmful, and also how people react to it, your reputation, how people look at you and how they view your actions and your deeds and your things, and they will either love you or hate you because of that, or be indifferent to you. Okay. They don't care. They benefit. They will look at you. You have a reputation. That reputation is based upon how others view you, and that has impact on your ability to rule, the ability to maintain your rule, and to be able to persuade others and motivate others in that sense. So Machiavelli is point here is that the sin of the Italians was not the sin of luxury and not paying attention to Christ. Rather, it was the sin of relying on mercenary arms. Okay, not establishing militias, not training the people, not arming the people, and maintaining the arms of this people, like the German cities and the Swiss in that sense. Okay, right? So let's continue here for a second in this line. Next paragraph. Third, I think this is fourth paragraph. I wish to demonstrate the infelicity of those arms. Period. Mercenary captains are either excellent men in arms or they are not. So, mercenary captains are either excellent men or not. So he's going to make a demonstration here. If they're excellent men or they're not. So that's the first premise, right? If they are, then you cannot trust them because they will always aspire to their own greatness by either oppressing you, their patron, or by oppressing others quite contrary to your intention. But if the captain is not virtuous, you are ordinary ruin. So if they're good, the problem is, wait a minute, then they're going to be ambitious. They're going to want their glory. And that means that they're going to either oppress you or oppress others you don't want oppressed. So therefore, this is, and that's harmful to you. You'd like to have them to do what you want, but sometimes their own ambition will get in the way. Order, forgive me. Their own ambition will get in the way, and therefore, this will harm you. But if they're not virtuous, then of course it's going to be your ruin. If they're not good virtuous, then you're ruined. Okay. And if one responds that this will not happen with anyone who has arms in hand, mercenary or not, I reply that as arms were employed either by the prince or by the republic, that a prince ought in person to take the office of captain, and a republic has to send its citizens. And when it sends one who does not prove worthy man, he ought to replace it. It ought to replace him, and when he is worthy, keep him within the laws, so he does not overstep the mark. Period. So wait a minute. What is he saying here? Okay. His response is, okay, if one responds, this will not happen with anyone who has arms in hand, mercenary, not this relying on mercenaries. And he says, oh yeah, I will reply that as arms are employed either by a prince or a republic. Now this is interesting. He talks about a republic. He says he's not going to talk about a republic. Again, this is another thing. He talks about a republic. He's giving an advice about a republic here. The advice for a prince is that you yourself, the prince, ought to be involved in the captain, should be involved in the office of captain. ought to be in person to take the office of the captain. Yes, in a republic, it has to send one of its citizens, and they better make sure the citizen they send is capable. And if he's not capable, replace him with someone who is. So therefore, this is interesting. We get a discussion about, in other words, the king. It's your. If you're the prince, it's your principality. You better be in charge. Now, if you're the, it's a republic, and the citizens pick, elect an officer. Make sure that officer can do it, and then if he doesn't do it, remove him to put someone else who can. And when he sends one who is and when it sends one who does not prove worthy man, it ought to replace him. When he's worthy, keep him within the laws, so he does not overstep his mark. Now, this is interesting. That for the republic, a good captain, a worthy captain, well, he needs to be what? He needs to be checked by the laws, so he doesn't overstep his mark and then turn against the state. Now, this is the point. This is interesting. The mercenary captain is very dangerous because the examples he gave of princes of wickedness were both mercenary captains who then turned against their hosts in order to get power. Okay, here is an example of a citizen, a republic that didn't care enough. In other words, you have to care about this. You have to have laws to check, to prevent. In other words, you can have citizens do it. You can have a citizen person. If he's successful and ambitious, you need laws to restrain them. You need the law to kind of restrain the ambitious. If you don't have that law to restrain it, then what happens? They will overturn the law. If there's no law to restrain them and protect them, their greatness will then seize control of the republic and turn it to and they will become the prince in that sense. And this is what his point about how civic. In other words, if you want to preserve liberty, you better have the law. Notice this. This is interesting. For no discussion of law, there's a discussion of law here. All right? Notice this. And he says that within the laws, so he does not overstep the marks. For no discussion of laws, there's a discussion of law. It's a discussion of law for particularly the republic. And, next sentence. And by experience, one sees that single princes and armed republics make very great progress, and that mercenary arms do nothing but damage. And the republic armed with its own arms is the most difficult brought to obey one of its is with more difficulty brought to obey one of its own citizen than one which is armed with foreign arms. Okay, so here's another one. In other words, it is much more difficult to have anyone. In other words, it's much more difficult to obey one of its own citizens than one which is armed with foreign arms. It's more difficult to obey one of its former citizens that is armed. In other words, the citizens armed with its own laws will have difficulty obeying one of its citizens than with one that's armed with its foreign laws. This is a very interesting point here. He's saying what? That therefore it's unlikely that you're going to have a coup. A republic armed with its own arms is more difficultly brought to obey one of its citizens. This is a good, in other words, an armed republic is going to have more difficulty than someone going to seize control. In other words, whereas if you relied on mercenary arms, if the foreign, in other words, if you had relied on a foreign arms to defend you or to preserve you, not your own arms, not the people or the citizens. In other words, you have to rely on others to do it. It's much easier to take it to have someone command you, to take command of you, and lose your liberty. Again, this is implicit here. Liberty is preserved by the people being armed. If you're relying on others to be who are armed, it's going to be easy for someone who wishes to take your liberty away to take your liberty away, because you're without recourse. And this is the point he's trying to say here. I'll repeat that line. He goes, and by experience, one sees that single princes and armed republics make very great progress, and that mercenary arms do nothing but damage. Semicolon. And the republic, armed with its own arms, is with the more difficulty brought to obey one of its own citizens than one which is armed with a foreign arm. In other words, one of its citizens can absolutely take control and force the citizens to comply. If you have foreign mercenaries, why? Because they're not citizens. They're gonna be foreigners, and they're doing it for the money. Okay. Now we could say the same. What happens when the police and our institutions no longer represent the population at large or the general reflection of the society, but rather just a segment of people who are just picked and paid and do it for their profession? And don't really share the values or the things of the community. Aren't they kind of become mercenaries in that sense? That's a thought to think about. To what degree, the story about the policemen who are not... What Machiavelli says about the mercenaries, think about what we experienced, and people in America experienced with the recent the shooting in school, where the policemen weren't willing to go rescue the thing because it's too dangerous for them. There's no duty to risk their lives to protect people. That would indicate that these people are no longer fellow citizens, but rather mercenary arms. They become mercenaries, and liberty has been lost in that sense. And this is what I think Machiavelli would say in this sense. Then let us turn. Next paragraph. The Rome and Sparta were for many centuries armed and free. Period. The Swiss are armed to the highest degree and free to the highest degree, and they still are armed. There's more automatic weapons in Switzerland today than anywhere, per person, than in even America. There's more. Okay, in America there's more automatic weapons than in Switzerland, but per person. In fact, automatic weapons per person. There's the higher percentage of people armed to the high with military grade weapons, because every citizen has to be armed and trained for the militia in Swiss. So they're armed and free to the highest degree. The Carthaginians are an example of ancient mercenary arms, and they were oppressed by their mercenary soldiers when the first war and the Romans with the Romans ended. And even though the Carthaginians had their own citizens as leaders, period. After the death of Epaminondas, this is the leader of Thebes, Philip of Macedon, who was a prisoner and is also a friend, kind of like the almost adopted child, was raised by Epaminondas to many degree because he was a hostage at the time from the Macedonians, was made captain of their people by the Thebans. And after he won victory, he took away their liberty. End of sentence. In other words, the example here of the Carthaginians were example of ancient mercenary arms, and what happened? Oh my God! Here, the example of Philip was he was a foreigner that they made head of the captain of their militia, and then he took their liberty away when he had to achieve this great victory. The Milesians hired Francisco Sforza against the Venetians after the Duke Filippo died, having overcome After overcoming their enemies at Cavero, he joined with them in order to oppress his patron, the Milanese. Period. Sforza the father, having been hired by Queen Genovini of Naples, left her in one stroke disarmed, whereupon, to save her kingdom, she was constrained to throw herself in the lap of King of Aragon. In other words, she had to throw herself. It's a very sexual metaphor here. Throws herself in the lap of Aragon. She had to basically, do something to get Aragon to help her, marry her, maybe offer things, throw her in her lap. and therefore, because her arms abandon her, the Sforzas. Now we get to the I think this is the 6th paragraph. And if the Venetians and the Florentines have in the past increased their imperium with these arms, yet their captains have not then made themselves princes, but have indeed defended them, I respond that the Florentines in this case have been favorites of chance, in other words, luck, in other words, fortune, chance. In other words, they say the Venetians and the Florentines. So that he says the examples of here, well, the case of the Florentines was by chance. He says, for of the captains who were virtuous and therefore to be feared, some of them won no victories. Some won no victories. Some had opposition. Others turned their ambitions elsewhere, period. The one who did not win any victories was Giovanni Acuto, John Hawkwood. And because he never won any battles, the Florentines could not know his faith. But everyone will confess, had he won, the Florentines would have been at his discretion, period. The Sforza always had the Bracci as their adversaries, so that each watched the other. Francesco turned all his ambition against Lombardy. Francesco turned all of his ambition to Lombardy, against Lombardy. Bracco against the church and the kingdom of Naples. But let us come to which recently occurred. The Florentines made Paleto Valenti, a most prudent man, their captain. He had, from private fortune, attained to a very great reputation. He had that man conquered Pisa. No one who could deny it would have been needful for the Florentines to stay with him. For if he had gone over to soldier for their enemies, they would have had no remedy. And if they'd kept him, they would have had to obey him. So the last example is the Paolo Ventili. So therefore, he addresses the Florentine examples, right? Why the Sforzas had the Brincelli, and therefore check on one another. Francesco turned his ambitions against Lombardy, therefore switched his ambition. Bracco against the church and Kingdom of Naples. So therefore, these are the various. He talks about Giovanni Acuto, Hawkwood, because he didn't accomplish anything. And then he talks about the Sforzas, and they because they had opposition, the Bracchi as the adversaries. And then Francesco, well, because he had another ambition. In other words, just all of this goes back to the things he said. Some won no victories, some had opposition, others turned their ambitions elsewhere. So right, so therefore the turning of ambition elsewhere is Bracco against the Church of and the Florentines. Then made this guy, and that if he won this, he would have had. If he won the Pisa, he would have. The Florentines would have been either afraid that he goes over to the enemy, or that therefore they would have to. If he stayed with them, they have to obey him. Okay. That's how that paragraph ends. The 7th paragraph begins, and if one considers the greatness of the Venetians, one sees that they acted securely and gloriously as long as they made war themselves. This was before they engaged in the enterprise on the land. In other words, the Venetians were mostly sea-going people. Venice was mostly an island, and it was mostly a sea-going people. And as long as they made their empire and their territorial gain on sea, by the sea, but once they turned to land, they had to rely on mercenaries, right? With their own gentry and armed plebs, they acted very virtuously. But when they began to fight on land, they lost their virtue and followed Italian customs in war. In other words, the Venetians, if they maintained their custom, but once they firing on land, they started imitating the other Italians, the other Italian states were always using mercenaries. So therefore, monkey see, monkey do. They started imitating the monkeys. And therefore, what happened was, oh my God, the Venetians, poor Venetians, they started to have the same problems as everyone else. Instead of relying on their plebs and in other words, their own gentry and their own plebs, they began to rely on mercenaries. And they followed the customs of the Italian customs. Again, remember, again, the Italian custom of relying on mercenary is the sin of Italy that Machiavelli thinks. The sin that that should be condemned. In the beginning of their argumentation on land, because they had very little state there, they had a great reputation. They had little to fear from their captains. But as they grew, as they did under Camelenguela, I can't pronounce that name, Camelenguela, they had a sample of this era, for they saw that he was most virtuous. They had fought the Duke of Milan under his command, and on the other hand, knowing how he had grown cold towards the war, they had judged that because he could no longer wish to conquer, that they could no longer conquer with him in command, and yet they could not let him go without losing what they acquired. Thus, they were necessitated, in order to secure themselves, to kill him. Okay, their leader, this guy, right? This guy, he was good. He was able to he was able to defeat the Duke of Milan and the mercenary forces of the Sforza. They achieved all this now, but if he went, they'd lose everything. And he would go to the enemy, and it'd be turned against him. So and they would lose everything they got. So they did something very interesting. In order to secure what they have gained, they cannot let them go without losing what they acquired. Thus, it was necessitated, in order to secure themselves, to kill him. They then had as their captains Bartolomeo la Bergamato, Roberto San Severino, and Count Pitagino, and the like, with which they had to fear defeat, not their captain's gain, as it indeed came to pass at Versailles, when in one battle they lost what it took so much toil they had acquired in 800 years. So it took 800 years of their toil to acquire. At that one battle, the mercenary captain lost it for them. Okay. For from these arms there comes slow, late, and weak acquisitions, and sudden and miraculous losses. So mercenary arms will give you slow, in other words, late, and weak acquisition, but sudden and miraculous losses. The losses are quick and big. The victories are slow, long, gradual, weak. In other words, slow, late, and weak, and very gradual, long term. What took 800 years was lost in a day. And because I have come with my examples to Italy, which has been for so many years governed by mercenary arms, I want to discuss them more from on high. In other words, this is that metaphor, on high and low. He goes, so that having seen the origins and progress of them, one can better correct them. Now he's going to say, I'm going to now talk about them from on high. Why? I can go low or I can go high. From the ordinary view and from the high view. No, he's going to go from the high view. There's a lot of notes in this chapter. There are this is like 23 notes. And the pages of notes go from page 76 to 80. Okay. And here, Machiavelli speaks of you in the next paragraph. It's 18, I think, yeah. This is the courtier second person. So it's very formal. He's very formal here. And he goes, you have then to understand that in recent time, as soon as Italy began to rebel against the empire, and the Pope gained such reputation in temporal matters, Italy was divided into more states. He's saying this. At one time, Italy was part of the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, it was part of the Roman Empire, and it was also part of the reestablishment of that. As what happened was the empire was divided into three after Charlemagne's succession. The one who ruled over Italy kind of took the one in France able to continue and maintain its kind of situation. The division over time, and what happened was the French king sought to solidify. What happened was that the empire, having no strong leader, and the Pope. Now this is the famous fight back when it happened between the Pope and the Emperor. And as the city sided with the Pope against the Emperor in order to get freedom from the Emperor, this led to the rise of the church's power, but also led to the rise of mercenary arms. For as many great cities took up arms against their nobles, who, as favorites of the emperor, had formerly oppressed them, and the church favored the city so she could gain for herself a reputation in temporal matters. And in many of these other cities, their own citizens became princes. Okay, in other words, this is footnote 19, where he talks about this. In other words, at 19, the names of Guelph, Wolf, and Gibertine, or Wallenby, were attached to the papal and imperial parties, respectively, during the struggles for the control of Italy. According to Daniel Wiley in his City-State Republic, Italian city-states, the term came into use in the reign of Frederick II. This is 1220 to 1250, but became attached to the anti and pro-imperial parties only in 1265, when the Guelph party became identified with the claims of the House of Anjou. Wolf was the family name of Otto IV, the Saxon opponent to Frederick II. Wildlinger was the name of the Hohenstaufen castle, which was used as the battle cry. It should be noted that the names of the Guelph and the Gibertine continued in long use after the original conflict. In other words, a lot of times the names of things continue after the original conflict. This is a very interesting point, which brought them into being had disappeared. Originally, the party of the merchants and the people were the Guelphs, and the feudal nobility were the Gibertines. But in Florence, by the end of the 14th, the Guelphs had become the oligarchic party. Thus, in 1378, there occurred the plebeian uprisings of the Campilli against the Guelphs. Now, this is again, he talked about in chapter 9 earlier. So therefore, well, what is this about? This is about the factions. In fact, this is Romeo and Juliet, the two families. Again, two sides, the factions of conflict. Here is that the church, he talks about the high point of what's going on here. The fight between the emperor and the cities, where the church sided with the cities against the emperor, led to a situation. And then all of a sudden, what happened? Their own citizens became princes. Okay? And then what happened? Whereupon Italy had almost completely into the hands of the church and a few republics. And these priests and other citizens, having no knowledge of the use of arms, they began to hire foreigners. This is because they didn't know, because the citizens, the merchants, because these merchants and their things had no understanding of arms. In this sense, they had no tradition of arms. And again, this may be the larger criticism of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, what happened was a specialization of arms among the warriors, among the caste of nobility, so that once the emperor's nobility was removed, they were the ones who normally had knowledge of arms, and that now the citizens who were mostly merchants and tradesmen, the successful city people, were not really trained in arms, and therefore they kind of didn't know about arms, and neither did the priests. So what did they do? They hired people who had knowledge, foreigners, Germans from the north usually, or Italians or French, soldiers, former soldiers of the French or the Spanish. They became hired because they had some knowledge, and they would be hired as mercenaries. So what happened was because they began to hire foreigners. He's talking about the history of why mercenary arms were shaped. The first who gave reputation for this kind of militia was Alberto di Comora, a Romago. From his school there descended, among others, the Braccolo and Sforza, who in their time were the arbiters of Italy. In other words, these mercenary houses. He starts mentioning them. What are they? These are the what? The Romago. Now this is 20, and then the Bracco and the Sforza. Now footnote 20 is interesting because this is a point that he talks about something. Amagoro di Bocora, Count of Colony, founded the Company of St. George, the first Italian company of mercenary soldiers. It was he who reintroduced the mounted soldier, or the men-at-arms, and the tactics suitable for such forces. Now, again, this repeats what he said earlier in the chapter about wickedness, right? About because they couldn't maintain enough soldiers, they relied on a horse. Because, in other words, these private mercenary companies couldn't afford to have large number of infantry, so they reintroduced horse, right? And this is what he says. They reintroduced the mounted soldiers, or the men-at-arms, and tactics suitable for such forces. That is to say, he founded the military mode in such an order, and to say that he founded a military mode and to do this. So, I have a guest about to come, so I have to finish up. So, let's just finish up the paragraph in that sense. This discussion of mercenary modes here, he continues here. So therefore, these are the schools of mercenaries: the Romago, the St. George, the armies of St. George. If that's in a note, then the Bracco and the Sforza, right? These mercenaries became the arbiter of Italy. And the result of their virtue Italy had been overrun by Charles, plundered by Louis, and violated by Ferdinand, and insulted by the Swiss. Okay, these examples. The last paragraph. The order which they have kept had been first to take away the reputation of infantry, to gain reputations for themselves. That is, they destroy infantry and rely on horse, right? They did this because, being men without state and dependent on their own industry, they were unable to feed many. And a few infantry could not give them a reputation, period. They were themselves reduced to horse, and to be supportable number of these they could feed themselves and gain honors, period. Second sentence. Third sentence. They were therefore reduced to such terms that an army of 20,000 soldiers, one could not find 2,000 infantry, period. Beside this, they used all their industry to free themselves and their soldiers from toil and fear, that they did not kill themselves in skirmishes, but took each other prisoners without ransom, period. They did not attack towns at night, nor did the towns attack their tents, and they constructed neither stockades nor trenches around their camps, They did not campaign in winter, period. What he's saying here. This is what happens. These are the customs that led to the mercenaries. The mercenary customs and the mercenary habits. All of them kind of bad. You want to fight in wintertime. You want to do this. You want to attack when you chance. These are in other words, the customs that the mercenaries created did maximize their pleasure and maximize their safety, minimize their danger. Next, in the last sentence of this paragraph in the chapter, and all these things were permitted by their military orders, which were founded by them to avoid, as had been said, toils and dangers, such that they conduced Italy into slavery and contempt. So that's just, it ends. This chapter ends with this condemnation of mercenary arms because of their way they've done, and how Italy, that was from high, that there was the orders of this was because people were ignorant of the people who took over power after the expelling of the emperor and emperor's control were ignorant of arms and ignorant of soldiers. So therefore relied on those who did. They relied on others. And what happened? Those became mercenary captains in the forces of the mercenary schools, and they became the arbiters. and they shaped, and what they did, they shaped military orders to benefit themselves and to keep control. And what did this do? This reduced Italy into slavery and contempt. Well, I have to finish right now. This ends our chapter 12. If you've liked this, please say hi. We're a little over. If you like this, thumbs up and share it with a friend. If you want to know more, please subscribe. If you're interested in following me on social media, please look below. Take care and have a good day. Bye-bye.